There are many feed products you can choose from to feed your off-the-track, which can make choosing the best feed challenging. Thankfully though, all the feeds have labels, which are incredibly useful if you know how to read them. Feed labels tell you what is in the feed, how much to feed, and what physical form the feed is in. You can also tell from a feed label how digestible a feed is likely to be and how high the protein quality is. And from all of this information, you can roughly determine if the feed will do a good job of things like providing the nutrients your off-the-track needs, maintaining gut health, and building muscle. While labels usually contain lots of information, it's sometimes not super easy to read. So join me for this Queensland off-the-track video and I will show you what to look for when reading a feed label. Then, when you next go to choose a new feed for your off-the-track, you'll know what you're looking for. Follow me. The first place I look on a feed bag I'm not familiar with is the ingredients. And here is what I'm looking for. One of the first decisions you should make when looking for a feed is whether you want the feed to be grain-based or grain-free. For off-the-tracks, both grain-based and grain-free feeds work well. But there may be situations like behavioural issues you're struggling to bring under control, or a long history of squamous gastric ulcers that may mean a grain-free feed has advantages. And it is as simple as reading the list of ingredients to see if the feed contains grain or if it's cereal grain-free. To qualify as truly grain-free, feeds shouldn't contain any cereal grains or cereal grain byproducts, or anything else that sounds remotely cereal grainy. These lists of grains and grain byproducts are in the ebook that goes along with this video, so you can refer to them if you need a reference for what is considered cereal grain and what isn't. The next thing you can determine from a feed's ingredient list is whether it is made using fixed or variable ingredients. If a feed has a very specific ingredient list with every ingredient named individually, it has a fixed list of ingredients. And all of those ingredients should be in every single batch of that feed. If a feed has a non-specific ingredient list and ingredients are named in groups with items listed like cereal grains or vegetable protein meals, or it specifically states that a feed will be made from a selection of ingredients from a specified list, the feed will be made using a varying selection of ingredients. Which type of feed you choose really comes down to your personal preference and your horse's needs at the time. The main drawback of a feed using variable ingredients is that the protein quality may be wildly variable. If your off-the-track is needing to build a lot of muscle, it is better to choose feeds that are made using fixed ingredients, with soybean meal or full-fat soybean listed in the ingredients. Let's look in a bit more detail at protein quality, which is one of the most important attributes of a feed that you can determine by looking at its list of ingredients. Protein quality refers to the balance and availability of the essential amino acids in a feed and influences your horse's ability to build muscle. Let's do a quick little protein chemistry recap. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Proteins are made up of about 20 different amino acids. 10 of these amino acids are called the non-essential amino acids because under most circumstances your horse can make them for themselves. The other 10 amino acids are called the essential amino acids because your horse must receive these in its diet. When your off-the-track eats protein in a feed, the enzymes in their small intestine cuts that protein up into single amino acids. Your horse absorbs these amino acids and then uses them to build muscle protein. Among the essential amino acids, lysine, methionine and threonine are particularly critical. They're known as the limiting amino acids because they're usually the ones a horse will run out of first. If any of these run out, muscle building stops. Much like a bricklayer would have to pause work if they ran out of bricks. Lysine, methionine and threonine are normally the ones you will see listed on a feed label, with higher levels indicating higher protein quality. Except, remember I said the biggest impact on feeds made using variable ingredients is on protein quality? This is because not all proteins are created equally. Cottonseed meal, for example, contains a decent amount of lysine, but around 60% of that lysine is unavailable for absorption. So it's in the feed, but it's useless to your horse. And in Australia, where cottonseed meal is abundant and cheap, it gets pulled into some of these variable ingredient feeds under the ingredient listing vegetable protein meal. A feed containing cottonseed meal will have good total lysine levels on the label, but the usable lysine content is low, which means if you are wanting to build muscle on your off the track, you are best to avoid feeds that list vegetable protein meals, as they may be poor sources of some of the essential amino acids, and that severely restricts muscle building capacity. A feed's ingredient list will usually also allow you to determine any grain processing method used to make the feed. Or it may say somewhere else on the label what processing method was used. For feeds containing grains or grain byproducts, it is important to pay attention to the feed's processing method, as processing method determines how digestible the starch a feed contains will be in the small intestine. The higher the small intestinal starch digestibility, the more energy your horse will extract from the feed, and the safer and better the feed will be from a hindgut health perspective, which we talk about in detail in video 12, how to maximise your off-the-tracks hindgut health. Very briefly, in Australia, research shows that extruded feed have the highest and most consistent starch digestibility, followed by properly micronized and steam flaked feeds. Raw grains have the lowest small intestinal starch digestibility, and with the exception of oats, should never be fed to horses, ever. The next thing to make a mental note of when reading an ingredients list is how much whole food ingredient variety there is, ignoring at this point the vitamin and mineral type ingredients. Some feeds are made with very few whole food ingredients. For example, they may list mill run and barley as the only two whole food ingredients. And other feeds are made with a broad range of whole food ingredients. For example, a single feed may list oats, barley, corn, wheat, meal mix, soybean, lupins and faba beans. The advantage of having so many ingredients is that they provide a broad spectrum of primary and secondary nutrients, as well as lots of different fibres to keep your horse and their microbiome healthy. The simple rule to follow is the more whole food ingredients, the better. You will, of course, be able to check ingredient lists carefully for any ingredients you want to avoid, either because they're unsuitable for your off the track or you simply prefer not to feed them. There is other small stuff I look at on a feed's ingredient list, like whether any of the vitamin E is in natural form and whether the feed contains any potentially useful ingredients like pre, pro or postbiotics, gut buffers and enzymes. But all of these are minor considerations in the scheme of things. The most important considerations are whether the feed you are looking at has the right type of ingredients that are processed in a way that makes them safe and digestible for your horse. Next, you should move on to looking at the nutrients and feeding rates to continue determining if the feed is right for your off the track. I'm going to talk about nutrient levels and feeding rates at the same time because they are inextricably linked. The feeding rates given for a feed are actually the amount of feed that needs to be fed to meet a horse's daily vitamin and mineral requirements. To give you an example, let's look at two feeds with different feeding rates using copper and vitamin E as example nutrients. Feed number 1 contains copper at 98 milligrams and vitamin E at 365 international units per kilogram. Feed number 2 contains copper at 51 milligrams and vitamin E at 230 international units per kg. In other words, feed number 1 has nearly twice as much copper and nearly 60% more vitamin E than feed number 2. And this is reflected in the feeding rates. With its higher nutrient concentration, feed number 1 can be fed at a lower feeding rate per day than feed number 2 and still meet vitamin and mineral requirements. In this case, feed number 1's feeding rate is 2 to 2.5 kilograms per day for a 500 kilogram horse in moderate work. Whereas feed number 2 needs to be fed at 3 to 4 kilograms per day to the same horse in order to meet nutrient requirements. Essentially, the higher the nutrient concentration, the lower the feeding rate. You will know with a fair degree of accuracy how many dippers of feed your off-the-track needs per day. They will either need a tiny bit, typically 1 dipper or less, a small amount of 1 to 2 dippers per day, a moderate amount of 3 to 4 dippers per day, or they may need a lot, up to 5 dippers per day. It varies with the feed, but one standard 2-litre dipper is roughly 1 kilogram of feed. So if you know roughly how many dippers of feed you need per day, just look for this number in the feeding rates given for your off-the-track's current activity and see if the numbers line up. For example, taking feed number 1 and feed number 2 from the examples earlier, if your 500 kilogram off the track is in moderate work and needs around 2 dippers of feed per day, feed number 1 is your best choice because it will meet your horse's daily nutrient requirements when fed at 2 kilograms per day. If you instead chose feed number 2 but only fed it at 2 kilograms per day, your off the track would only be getting about half of their daily vitamin and mineral requirements met. You could top up with a vitamin and mineral supplement to fix this, but that adds more complexity and expense to your feeding program. That could be avoided by choosing a more appropriate feed in the first place. In the reverse, if your off the track needed around 4 dippers of feed per day and you chose feed number 1 and fed it at 4 kilograms per day when its feeding rate for a 500 kilogram horse is 2 kilograms per day, you would be way overfeeding vitamins and minerals, and this is not ideal either. Choosing a feed by simply looking at the feeding rates and selecting a feed based on the one that has the right feeding rate for your horse saves you getting all tangled up in how much of this nutrient or that a feed contains on its nutrient table. However, not all feeds are created exactly equally. And often there is definitely advantage to taking a more analytical approach to feed selection, looking closely at the nutrient levels and how they match with your horse's workload, forage and fibres. But to do that, you need tools. There are simply too many nutrients and too many variables to calculate that stuff by hand. Even for me, it would take me more than a day to accurately calculate out and balance a diet looking at over 30 nutrients. So if you want a more substantial method of selecting the right feed for your off the track than feeding rate tables, then use an online tool like FeedXL or an app like My Happy Horse. These tools will calculate your horse's daily nutrient requirements, accurately estimate what is being supplied by the foragers, and calculate what is being provided by feeds and supplements, so you can know your horse's diet is correctly balanced. The last little detail you might like to pay attention to on a feed label is the physical form the feed is in. Feeds are typically presented as pellets or extruded cubes or sweet feeds, usually with a molasses coating, or meals or mashes that are fed wet. You or your off-the-track may have a preference for the type of feed that you use. And the label should tell you or show you what specific form a feed is in, so you can select a feed in the form you want. Choosing the right feed for your off-the-track gives you an excellent shot at keeping your horse calm, healthy and happy, and helps you keep feeding time simple and as cost-effective as possible. The important things to remember when reading a feed label are: read the ingredients list carefully. The ingredients will tell you if the feed contains grain or if it's grain-free, whether the feed is made with fixed or variable ingredients, what the protein quality and muscle building capacity of the feed is likely to be like, how digestible the starch will be, and therefore whether it will be safe or damaging to the hindgut, how much ingredient variety the feed contains, if there is ingredients you want to avoid, and whether there are any potentially useful micro-ingredients like natural vitamin E or postbiotics. Avoid variable ingredient feeds and look for soybean meal or full-fat soybean when your off-the-track needs to build muscle. Pay close attention to the feeding rate tables and choose a feed that has a recommended feeding rate similar to the amount you know your off-the-track needs to maintain weight. Use diet formulation tools like FeedXL or My Happy Horse to really dig into the details of your horse's diet when you want to be more accurate. There are a mind-boggling number of feeds available, and it really can get confusing when trying to choose a feed. But hopefully, with what you have learnt here, you will now be able to more easily sort feeds into suitable or not suitable categories for your horse, and be able to make informed feeding choices that are in the best interest of your off-the-track.